For decades now, we've been inundated with inaccurate, misleading, and deceptive media coverage of nuclear power, uranium exploration, and mining. But Jay, is nuclear power really as dangerous as they say?
Well, it's just the opposite. And our guest today is going to tell us just how safe it is. It's actually the safest form of energy on the planet. It's unfortunately that so many people opposed it so many years ago, and a few incidents turned people against it. But it really is the safest form of energy and will undoubtedly run the world some centuries hence. It's declining in the United States, but growing elsewhere in the world. And that's what we'll be talking about with our guests. So go ahead and introduce him.
Yeah, sure. Our guest today is Houston, Texas-based geologist Michael D. Campbell. Michael is Senior Principal and Chief Hydrogeologist of I2M Consulting, LLC. This is a professional practice offering experienced geologists, hydrogeologists, and other geoscientists, and project managers with many years' experience in assessments and other activities. And we'll link to the organization I2M Consulting under the podcast when it goes up online on Monday. Michael serves in a variety of technical and management functions, ranging from operational management to field work and supervising drilling and sampling programs to performing groundwater modeling and associated maps and database construction. He is the author and co-author of many publications. For example, one very relevant to today's interview, Jay, a 2018 paper titled Confronting Media and Other Bias Against Uranium Exploration and Mining, Nuclear Power, and Associated Environmental Issues. That was published in the Journal of Geology and Geoscience, and we'll link to this paper in the program description, again, when it goes to podcast on Monday. So welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good.
Michael, in your writings, you made note of a couple nuclear power plants, I believe, being built in Georgia and South Carolina. Could you bring me up to date on those? I've heard they're way behind time and way over budget. And what I've read made me think that they may never be completed. Could you give us an update on them?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting story, actually. It started out poorly for Westinghouse. Westinghouse, in fact, a few years ago, went bankrupt, and their main manager is probably heading for prison for misdeeds. But the people in and around Georgia and South Carolina, where the Vogtle plant is, it has already two nuclear reactors. They got their stuff together, and even with the over budget, but with the help of some help from the government and what have you, they're in the process of finishing that now, and it should be ready sometime next year. And that site will contain 4 reactors and will produce the highest output of any in this country.
Well,
Michael, you just made my day, because I had heard nothing but bad things. And I think to get some new plants up and running is going to help move the whole program throughout the country. But have we lost preeminence in manpower knowledgeable about nuclear engineering with all the years that we've gone without building a plant?
Well, oddly enough, of course, we've lost hands-on experience because we haven't built anything until Vogtle started and continued. But strangely enough, over the past 10 years, all of the major universities have nuclear engineering, active nuclear engineering schools. They're loading up, and the anticipation is getting to be rather large that there's going to be an expansion in construction here pretty soon. University of Michigan, I should say, probably tops out. MIT is very close to the top. Even Ohio State has a good nuclear engineering program going on. Penn State has probably number 4. So to answer your question, Jay, I think we're getting on the wagon now. When you compare that against China has thousands and thousands of students working on nuclear power plant engineering and related. So, but we're not doing bad.
Well, this is more good news for me personally, because I've got such an interest in nuclear power, and certainly for our audience. I would imagine the little bits and pieces our audience read over the years has not been positive. So you've uplifted everybody in this area. Now, people are reading about small modular reactors, and I don't think they really have a good idea of what they are. In the article that we wrote about your work that appears now in AmericaOutloud.com, we showed a modular reactor being towed on a truck. I don't know how accurate that is, but try to explain the concept of the new small modular reactors and where they've been used in the world and where they're likely to be used in the United States.
Okay, sure, Jay. I'm rather excited about the SMRs and even the micro reactors, because there's maybe 50, 75 companies right now that are working very hard to put together small modular reactors that'll turn out to produce something like 100 to 200, maybe 300 megawatts. And then they can be modularized. If you want 1,500, you get 4 units. If you only want 2 units, you can break it up. You don't have to have one great, huge plant that takes years to put together. But I guess the most important thing, it's already started. Bill Gates and the boys in Wyoming are in the process of taking over an old coal processing plant, and they're going to use the infrastructure that coal processing plant that used to make electricity, take over the infrastructure and build an SMR at that site as a demonstration. I think probably within the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to see a lot of those. In fact, I can foresee small modular reactors in neighborhoods. The idea is to get away from this big power grid and have little microgrids everywhere. So if one went down, it wouldn't be so bad, and it can be fixed eventually, but it wouldn't take the whole grid down. So I'm excited about this. To answer your final aspect of your question is, have we built them yet? No. But in 1958, the submarine Nautilus was the very first small modular reactor. And it worked perfectly for many, many years. And most of our ships and submarines are still running on small modular reactors.
Mm-hmm. How long do they last before you have to, like, I guess you don't refuel them, eh?
Well, that's really fascinating, and as far as I can see, is it uses a fairly high grade uranium in their fuel, but they don't have to refuel for 5 or 6 years, if not more. And so that's why they can go down under and sit there for a couple of years and not worry about having to come up to like the old submarines have to recharge their batteries. But the fact is, I think if there's a bright note in nuclear power, it's SMRs.
Mm-hmm. Small modular reactors. Wow, that's great.
Right.
Now, I've had a problem with the nuclear industry forever. Some years ago, I edited an encyclopedia of nuclear power, which came out right at the time of Fukushima, and the TV stations found me very quickly because of that, and I did a whole bunch of TV shows explaining that the situation at Fukushima was likely not going to kill anybody, and probably not even much radiation poisoning, for which I got death threats for the next 3 years. But in editing that book, I went to the Nuclear Energy Institute, and they were surprisingly of no help at all. They are really a public relations group with very little expertise. But it's bothered me that they have tied their future over the years to the fact that they don't emit carbon dioxide, so that they essentially buy into what Tom and I consider to be the human-caused global warming fraud. Where do you stand within that issue as regard to the nuclear industry?
Well, I can't speak for the nuclear industry, but I'm the only one standing right at this moment, so I will. I think the nuclear industry's role is a strong one with respect to limiting and aiding and abetting our efforts toward climate change. Now, you and I may have differences in that, Jay, but the fact is, as soon as we can get rid of coal plants and then sneak up on natural gas, the better off we'll be in terms of air, climate issues and all that.
Well, I think in terms of air pollution, I will say I get quite involved in coal. The coal plants of today are not the coal plants of yesterday, and we can burn coal that's quite clean. But we'll leave that alone, and let's go to Japan. I mentioned Fukushima. right after Fukushima, Japan shut down most of their reactors. And as I recall, they were getting almost half of their power from nuclear power at the time of Fukushima. But I understand, and I've read some of your writings, that they're coming back. They're, let's say, came to their senses and are overcoming the negative reactions of Fukushima. Could you tell us where Japan stands now and where they're likely to go in the coming years?
Yes. I must say that the recent prime minister just announced that they are in fact going to light up their plants that have now been safety checked, and certain factors have been considered now about the plants that are built along the coast with respect to tsunamis and protecting the power supplies and what have you. But I got to say on the side, Jay, I was very proud of you when I was watching the news in those days to see you pop up and give the people at the bulletin of the so-called atomic scientists all sorts of hell about exaggerating and all that. So, boy, you got a big star for your forehead in reverse.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. It was
Sure.
it was fun doing it. And I have a friend that wrote a book on nuclear some years ago, and he explained that you could fly one of our biggest commercial jets into a nuclear power plant, properly constructed, which all of them are now. And all you do is shut off the power from the plants, but you wouldn't release radiation or cause any other damage unless you had some employees in the way. So I'm glad to hear that Japan is coming back. Now that brings me to France. Now, France has been the leader, most of our lives, producing 75% of their power. But I'm reading things where they're getting shaky with anti-nuke people in France. What do you know about that?
Well, yes, I've been following that pretty carefully. In fact, as you probably know, Jay, I've been following nuclear power developments for, quite closely since about 2004, when I was appointed as the chairman of the Uranium Committee, the Energy Minerals Division of the AAPG, which is the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. Mm-hmm. I have been associated with that group, not because of the oil and gas issues, but my job was to let the people know, let the geologists know in the AAPG what their competition is and is likely to be in the future. So I spoke out rather heavily regarding nuclear power ever since then, as the data allowed. But to answer your question, France, it's not as you may seem to think right now, because the only reason France is turning down some of their nuclear power plants is, oddly enough, related to the increasing river temperatures that are in their cooling circuits are affecting their efficiencies, and they're starting to actually have an impact on the nuclear power production. So they're turning those down until they figure that out. They're not down on nuclear power. It's just that the practicalities of this is the first time I've heard about the problems of the rivers heating up with all the high temperatures in Europe. That should be just not long, but so they've had to turn some of them down. But they're not against them.
Can you tell us why would a river warm up near a nuclear station?
Well, it's not. It's upstream. The whole area having experienced major heat. What do they call them? Heat fronts, whatever they call it. Anyway, heat waves. Yeah, has even heated up the rivers. And even though the rivers are usually, as you know, Jay, usually supplied by the groundwater in the area, and that comes out rather cool. It doesn't take long when you're exposed to surface water in the rivers, when there's a heat wave on, apparently to take up the temperatures to the degree that makes them difficult to use for nuclear power plant cooling.
Now, do the plants themselves actually warm the water in a dangerous way?
They have to warm the water because they have to cool the rods when they take them out and put them on the side and trying to get them to cool down to the point where then they can then put them in canisters if they nearby once they get to a certain lower temperature. But they still have to cool the rods when they pull them out. Because when nuclear power, all it does is heat water. Heat water, turn the turbine, and it makes electricity. And when you're heating the water, and even though you can control that with the fuel rods, when you have to change the rods, you're going to have to keep those rods, let them cool down as best you can. It'd be nice to have ice cubes to put there all the time, but no one do that. So you just have to use the water. That's why the water supply for nuclear power plants is very, very important.
So it can't be too hot to start out.
That's right. It turns out. I mean, I would have never guessed that was a problem, but I would have guessed the quantity might have been a problem, but not the temperature. So.
Yeah, well, to help diffuse anti-nuclear people, what about those who might say, oh, but you're warming the river with your reactors? Is it really very significant, the amount of?
Bottom line is yes, it's a warming of the river, but usually, as I said, the river water is often generally cooler because it's actually groundwater that comes, and that's a low temperature right off the bat. But as it comes down, it is being heated up. And that's why you'll find most power plants around the coasts. And of course, being around the coast opens up, that eliminates the water temperature issue, but it opens up another issue. And that means like Fukushima, and that's why you have to build these things to withstand such things as Fukushima experienced.
Right, for sure.
Well, is the anti-nuclear movement in the U.S. declining, do you think? When I was doing those TV shows after Fukushima, I didn't get the idea that it was, but recently they seem to have lost power in my mind, and I think partly because I am reading about small modular reactors and not seeing too much pushback. How would you describe, I guess I'll call it, the anti-nuclear industry today?
Well, I would call them steady. From my early days of 20, 30 years ago, first getting really interested in the subject, even to now, because it's sort of like once an anti-nuclear, always an anti-nuclear, but there are some actually very important differences. There's a couple of top leaders out of Environmental Defense Fund or maybe that other one, Sierra Club, one of the founders or co-founders or something, he decided that after a while that nuclear power was pretty good. So he's going around the country and has been for years speaking on the pro-nuclear issues. So it can't change.
Michael Dellenberg.
Yeah. These people, though, that get it in their mind about anti-nuclear, they don't want to hear reality. And that brings up an interesting point. That whole anti-nuclear thing is based on one thing, and that is fear. Fear from the very beginning, fear starting in Japan when the bombs were dropped, and nobody that group can get over it. Even 2 days ago, I watched Rachel Maddow and Lawrence O'Donnell. That something came up about the problem in Ukraine and whether that's going to blow up. And then they went into about a 5-second tirade of, oh my God, the nuclear power, what are we going to do? So I wrote both of them, a really detailed, nasty sort of, now listen, you people, I respect you, but you got to get over this business. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, David Suzuki, an environmentalist in Canada, when he spoke about nuclear power in the past, he had nuclear bombs going off on the screen behind him. So, I mean, can you help diffuse that connection, the idea that somehow you're going to turn all these reactors into bombs?
I can a little bit, and that is, it's simple. Nuclear power only uses fuel that is very, very low grade, and the fuel comes out of the ground at a few percent, but it's really a matter of how much U-235 is in that fuel. You want about 3 to 5% of U-235 to go into the fuel pellets for nuclear power. In order to do a bomb, you need about 95% of U-235 to make a bomb. Now, that's why it takes a long time to spin through the centrifuges to upgrade these. And that's what's going on in Iran. And they have the hundreds and hundreds of centrifuges that takes forever to spin out the U-235 away from U-238. And it takes forever to do that. And so we've been watching, and that's why it takes a while to turn off the 238 and to concentrate the 235.
So the byproducts of nuclear reactors are not going to be used for weapons.
No, no. I mean, the whole idea is because it's radioactive, and woe is me, radioactive, and same with the waste. Once you cool down the rods in the plant, and they can be carted off next door and around the corner to the canisters. Jim Conca does an outstanding job on 3 YouTube presentations talking about how he leans up against it. It's not even warm. And so the idea, I used to have a concern about the storage on site when the storage place went down.
Yucca Mountain.
Yeah, Yucca Mountain got lost somehow. But then I started realizing, looking around what was being done, and then Jim Conca started doing a lot of studying too on it. And he found out that there was nothing to it. It's just fine. People can't bang into it. They can't blow it up. They can't do anything. Even if it were, it's not all that heavy duty radioactivity in there. It's slowly, it's radioactive, but it's got enough of a design in those canisters to protect the problem. So and yet I see people now more talking about waste issues than any other part of anti-nuclear thing. And yet all the waste that we've ever produced here in this country, you can put on a football field 30 feet deep.
And I had
a heck of a lot.
No, you're right. I had a professor, Jerry T. Rogers, who was a nuclear expert here at Carleton University in Ottawa. And he said that you could hold a used CANDU reactor bundle in your hands after only 4 centuries. And in fact, they were talking about storing it deep underground in the geologic formation.
That's another issue. That's another issue of disposal. We don't need to dispose of that. I mean, all the money that goes into deep disposal, we don't need to dispose them. And that seems like one of the not the bridge things that we used to talk about, Jay. Surface water versus groundwater issues. The surface water being an engineering project. Well, the same with the disposal of nuclear waste. That's an engineering project that I don't think we really need to worry about.
Really? So you don't think we need deep geologic storage?
No.
Well, that's good to hear.
I totally agree. A little bit of an anecdote, but it relates to what we're talking about. Have either of you seen Top Gun Maverick?
Oh yeah, what a great film!
I think it's the best movie I've ever seen. I bought it for $20, and I'm watching portions of it over and over again because it moves very quickly, and there's a lot of technical things I've got to watch over. But the whole premise of the movie is to blow up an Iranian facility that is making a bomb-grade nuclear material, and it's buried deep in the ground in the worst geologic situation in terms of getting to it. And so training pilots to get to it is the theme of the movie. It's really quite true. So I was going to ask you, Michael, if you thought it was done from a reality standpoint. You got to go see it, and we'll ask it another time.
Yeah. My son asked me last week if he wants to go see it, and I said, I don't have time, but I will now.
Well, it really, let me tell you, it really is worthwhile. But in an effort for transparency with things that we've been talking about for the audience, Michael and I go back forever. Michael was kind of a student of mine, and together we wrote a book called Water Well Technology, which I think was published in 1973, which I think kind of launched both of our careers. And I will be forever grateful because Michael was the driving force of the project, and it's still around. And so we're 2 unusual scientists that haven't lost a step. We're still working at our trade, and our professional is hard today as we were when we began in the early 70s. So that's really very, very exciting.
Well, it was exciting too for me, Jay, because the whole story there is Jay hired me as his research associate at Ohio State. I don't know why, I don't remember how that even happened, but he and I built his groundwater modeling apparatus, and I ended up making this 6-ton thing that we were going to do a 3-dimensional, if you remember that. And that's the last thing I did before I headed off to Australia to get into the mining business. So
Yeah, that's great.
Michael, what are the committees in our government that are currently in charge of promoting or defeating nuclear power?
Well, the primary one that I remember thinking about, and I wrote it down somewhere here, but the Committee on the Environment and Public Works seems to be the most active with, I forget the fellow's name that chaired it before the Democrats took over, but he did a good job of getting things moving. Again, what's his name?
James Inhofe?
Oh, no. Anyway, he's from Wyoming, this senator, and I don't remember his name. Anyway, so I think they're the ones that handle it, but most of it is the Department of Energy, of course, and they're doing a great job of supporting both. And now I don't know how they talk about renewables and nuclear power at the same without getting in cross purposes. But I have yet to see any of the releases by the renewable energy section of the DOE talking trash about nuclear power, and they just don't talk about the crosstalk. So, so that's about all I can tell you that I know, Jay.
Well, I've got some good news in that. Since you mentioned, you wonder how do they deal with wind and solar and then nuclear and other things. You know, it's we've gotten to the point in energy. People say all of the above. Well, Tom and I will tell you that we have feel no support for wind and solar that are simply undependable. But there was a bill passed just a week or so ago, one of the big money bills that throws a huge amount of money in supporting wind and solar, but you've got to read the fine print to find out that for every acre and every dollar supporting wind and solar, they've got to lease public lands for oil and gas development. And it opened up 2,700 square miles in the Gulf of Mexico to lease. So this, we're not going to have any more oil and gas is clearly not going to happen, and people are getting more practical. And it was Senator from Manchin of West Virginia that really pulled it off. I would say snookered the wind and solar people by getting oil and gas on an equal footing. So I think you're describing the committees and wondering, you know, how they can be at cross purposes with different forms of energy. I think we're settling into an all of the above, and we're probably wasting some of the money, but we're also doing some, in my opinion, good work with some of the other money.
Well, I agree, Jay, and I can add a little bit to that in that it's already started the movement away from wind and solar, because if you look at Germany, and if you look at Switzerland, and if you look at Finland and a couple others around the world, they're starting to, they came on strong with wind and solar, and they're realizing wind and solar cannot handle it. They just cannot handle it, both in terms of the amount of energy and the long-term economics of it. And I think that's going to slowly happen, and we'll look back once and say, okay, we played with wind free energy. Now, let's see, that's what caught everyone's attention, mostly on the left, because it was free energy, sun and wind. I mean, that you can't beat that. But what they don't realize is there are details in that just doesn't make it. And the biggest problem is the operation and maintenance of these existing these existing wind and solar projects are just now coming in, and that's why it's starting to drive up the prices of these wind and solar. And okay, it's easy to install them, but it's more costly to operate and maintain them. And that's what's going to cook them, in my judgment.
So, Michael, Joe Biden thinks that he can actually get rare earths from Canada instead of course, China and places like that. So is that realistic?
Yes, I've been, well, yes, in terms of I've been following the rare earth issues for some time also, because they tend to go along with uranium, and many hard rock uranium rare earths are associated just naturally in the mineralization and the geological association. So I've been following that too. Canada is rather fortunate because in eastern Canada, and in other parts. Eastern Canada have a lot of good geology that's favorable for rare earth, and I know there's 3 or 4 deposits that are almost ready to go to mine and to start producing. And of course, you know, Tom, that having rare earth is one thing, but you have to process it too, because we've got to get the dysprosium out and the other high value numbers of the or types of rare earth. And that tends to be a problem. Some of our people here in the U.S. are looking at that carefully, and some of them may be coming on pretty strong. There's a deposit in Texas, and a Demers, a Chimers, which is a spinoff of DuPont, one of my old companies I used to work for, is getting heavily into the processing aspects of rare earths. So I think we're coming, and if people like Biden and anybody who's there that has a chance to have their head screwed on properly and can move things along that we should have. Now we have potential rare earths in this country as well, in the U.S., especially associated with a project I've been working on since the 1970s until 3 Mile Island happened, which brought that to a halt. I've recently just decided to make an announcement about that, and I did a presentation at a conference a year and a half ago about a deposit that we worked on in the 70s when I was still at Rice University, and I used Rice graduate students. Jay, you may probably remember that, and that's where we had our NWWA research facility at Rice there for a while. And I took them to the Seward Peninsula, and we found quite a lot of rare earth and uranium. And the interesting thing is there's a basin right next to it that we realized recently could well be a new district, a whole new uranium district, which opens up possibilities for not having a problem, which would be not only the uranium in the basin, but also the rare earths and the hard rock areas that's associated right close to it. So,
Well, that's good news. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, the rare earth thing. Go ahead, Tom.
So, Michael, how long would you say that we could run our current society if we got all of our electricity from nuclear? I mean, is it virtually indefinite, or is there, a time limit in your mind?
Okay, to run it means the fuel. We have a lot of fuel. We have a lot of uranium deposits around the world. And if we really get into a pinch, we've even discovered, the geological industry, let's call it, have even come across the idea that we can get uranium out of seawater.
Oh, wow.
If we really get a pinch, and since there's a lot of seawater, and that means there'll be a lot of uranium. Even if it's a couple parts per million, it wouldn't take long to get a fair amount of uranium. But the uranium doesn't have to last us that long, because I think we're in a transition into fusion anyway, and into fusion power. Now, when that's around, I have no idea. The closest I got to fusion was mine.
I want to have a little controversy for our audience, which I think they will enjoy. I've written a number of articles, and I will continue to write a number of articles on the fact that we will never have commercial fusion. Now, I have a little early insight to it. And you certainly will remember that when I was at Princeton, Michael, I had a nodding acquaintance with Albert Einstein. We didn't chat much, but we knew each other. And this would be back in 1955. And Albert said that we were 50 years away from nuclear fusion, and 50 years later, we were still 50 years away. And people on my side feel that we'll always be 50 years away. But I've written a number of articles, and there was one that came out just this week. The big energy institute for the government out in California, whose name you would remember. What's the biggest one in Northern California? Anyway, they just put 192 lasers on a tiny capsule of uranium, and they got a millionth of a volt of energy. And that's similar to the amount of energy they've gotten in Zurn, Switzerland, where they have a tokamak, a circular device that runs atoms around, and when they collide, you get fusion energy. And they're also working in the millionths of the volts. But the interesting thing about the experiment just last week or so is they couldn't replicate it. I mean, they got a millionth of a volt once and they couldn't replicate it. So, people are hopeful of fusion because supposedly it's totally safe, unlike fission. But you've already described earlier in the show how safe nuclear energy is. People shouldn't be worried about fission. There is a radiation that it does not exist with fusion, but we've got it so under control. And I agree. Well, I'll answer Tom's question about how much uranium fuel do we have. I'm very aware of the fact that we can get uranium from the ocean. Obviously, it's more expensive. But I've been reading your stuff and everything I can get my hands on uranium fuel. And it's questionable in my mind we can ever run out. Certainly many, many centuries, and I would say thousands of years. So the world will run on nuclear energy one way or another, many centuries hence.
And I can only push back by saying the only reason I have an increased feeling that fusion will come around sooner or later is because of all the money that's going into that. Now, there's huge, it's not just a trickle here and there. It's huge amounts of money going into fusion research now with 10 or 15, maybe 20 companies that are, not just on the stock market. So that's my only reason for.
Okay. Well, I am well aware of every one of those dollars, but I'll tell you something that you might not have figured out. All of the money with all of the companies spent on fusion is dwarfed by the amount of money that has been spent on wind and solar the last 30 years, and it has not advanced at all. So the fact that you pour a lot of money in, really means it doesn't mean anything, but I can't argue. Tom, you're about to ask something.
I defer, Professor.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Michael, how effective have we been in stopping Iran and North Korea and even Russia in continuing to build nuclear weapons?
Well, that's a good example of conflating matters, conflating bombs and bullets with nuclear power. And that's one of the things that my opposition just love to do in writing their articles. They'll slip in something about a bomb or how it's going to be made just to scare the bejesus out of everybody. And then they go back to their normal diatribe, misinformation about nuclear power. But to answer your question, I know nothing, very little about that subject.
Okay.
I'll jump in and answer it because I follow North Korea, very carefully, and Russia more now than ever because of Ukraine. And we have not been at all successful in stopping them, let's say, be nuclear weapon prepared. But from a political standpoint, fear of a nuclear war, fear of a nuclear explosion really can be taken off the table. What you have are insane, power-hungry people, the little guy in North Korea, the people in Iran, and of course, Putin in Russia. And the thing that the more you learn about them, the thing that they like more than power is their own lives. They all are smart enough, as crazy as they are, to know that one nuclear bomb anywhere would be the end of their rule, the end of their lives. And it's kind of, you remember, what was that? Mutual nuclear deterrent. I can't remember what MAD stood for.
Mutually assured destruction.
Right. Well, and it really is to a certain, it's effective mostly at the level of the insane people that run these countries. So we've not been at all effective in stopping them from building bombs, although Israel has been very effective stopping Iran. We may remember a few years ago, they took an entire plant off. It was a bunch of buildings one day. The next day, it was level as a farm field, ready to be planted. So I would say that Israel is the best deterrent for Iran, and even to a certain extent. So it's something people shouldn't worry about, but we haven't stopped it. But this all buys into the fear thing, which you mentioned earlier in the show. What can we do let's talk about part of our audience that totally agrees with everything we say. They understand the importance of nuclear power. They understand the exaggeration of the problems that existed in the various incidents from Chernobyl to 3 Mile Island to Fukushima. What can an individual do to convince others that nuclear power is really the best long-range way to electrify our nation?
Well, they can, first of all, they can, if they're really interested in convincing others, they should be looking at sources, good sources, reliable sources of information. Now, these days, it's kind of hard to talk about that subject because there's so much garbage and all that around in the internet. But learn who knows what, and who has the best credentials, and where do they stand in their profession before you start listening very carefully. But I think there's enough information around, especially from our government. The DOE is putting out some very good stuff, and I haven't yet to see anything that's been overblown or unduly discussed that was over the top. So I would start with the DOE information, and then look for. Well, if you go to Google and just type in nuclear power, you could probably train yourself to go through and look for odd statements, conflating. In fact, that article that we did a couple of years ago on anti-nuclear and the bias of the media might be a place to start, because it tends to be subtle. You can tell pretty quickly whether someone is writing what they are about the negatives of nuclear power when in fact they're being paid by wind and solar people. Find out where their funding comes from. Some of them are even coal, some of them are oil and gas funded. So you have to be a good sleuth to figure out what's really good information now these days. So I would suggest start with that article and go from there, touching with the DOE.
And one good way to get this information out to the public is twofold. One is, when you hear radio talk shows criticizing nuclear, call in right away and say, hey, listen to the America Out Loud interview with Michael Campbell, and actually bring up some of these points. The other thing, of course, to do is to go with a group of friends. And it's good to have a group of friends because it's strength in numbers. To one of these big, anti-nuclear debates or presentations or whatever, and when you have a chance, you go to the microphone and you say, I think that nuclear actually is the safest form of electricity. And it's interesting because what I've found is if you do that kind of thing, the enviros in the audience will of course boo like crazy. But if you have a group of people who can clap for you and also then go to the mic and say, I agree with that guy, so I think it's a matter of speaking out more.
Yeah, Michael Schellenberger does a good job and covering a lot of taking to task the anti-nuclear people. He almost by himself and a group of mothers in Southern California have been able to take care of the Diablo Canyon problem. That was scheduled to be taken offline, but due to their efforts, the governor has postponed that indefinitely. Wow. And of course, that brought up a lot of lists of a fellow by name, I won't even mention his name. That set off an article I just read this morning about how that was the worst thing that could be done, which is, we go through in line and talk about it. But I would say we need a spokesman like Michael Schellenberger. And I got to say, Jay Lair, I would just love to somehow convince Jay Lair to become the mouth of nuclear power, because Jay was in my days with him early, and I'm sure he still is. Even when I saw you in Ohio, when I was given that presidential address, and Jay showed up at that presentation and joined me in the discussion, as I would imagine at the time, and I fully expected it. But if somebody like Jay could get out there and start speaking as well as he speaks, that would go a long way toward ensuring energy source.
Michael, actually, I do that as often as I can, and I'll even do it for a couple minutes to our audience right now. I teach nuclear physics to fifth graders, and I have no problem. One of my comments is always, nuclear physics is not rocket science. It's really very simple. And Michael alluded to it in the beginning. It's just a matter of heating water. You left out the fact that the water has to become steam, and then the steam runs through a turbine and you get electricity. It really couldn't be any simpler. But you have a certain level of uranium that just naturally degrades, goes to a different form, and one of the byproducts is heat. And eventually that heat can be turned into steam, and the steam turns a turbine. It's really not very complex. I can tell you, making electricity from a solar panel is way more complicated than nuclear is. And as we've already talked earlier, it's incredibly safe. One of the things, Chernobyl, well, of course, dropping the atomic bomb to end World War II is where, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, is where the fear all started. But the Russians built this plant actually in Ukraine, Chernobyl, which no Western country would ever build. It had virtually non-safety systems. They did everything wrong, besides the fact it was the result of an experiment by operators that were not well trained. Nothing could have been wronger. And yet most people are not aware, in this worst case scenario, the actual death toll was 49. Half of them were firemen that died trying to put out the explosion, and the other half from radiation shortly that were nearby. So, we've been fighting a lot of information. And the more, you're absolutely right. I love talking about nuclear because it is really so simple to explain. And I love what you said, how easy it is to store nuclear waste. It doesn't have to be put, 1,000 feet at the base of a mountain like they were trying to do at Yucca. We can manage the waste, and I love your analogy. 30 feet deep on a football field would be all the waste that we have created. Another point is, you mentioned the nuclear submarine that has the small modular reactor that can stay underwater for long periods of time. We have launched 200 nuclear ships, and there hasn't been a single accident. There hasn't been a single sickness, not one fatality. The record of safety actually around the world. In this country, we've only lost 4 people in a research reactor in Idaho in 1976, and it was a series of mistakes. So it is really the safest form of energy, and I certainly wouldn't turn down any opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah. That Idaho thing was also, you couldn't relate it to a mistake in the technology. Apparently, there was some subterfuge and a fight between 2 of those fellows over a wife, that he thinks somebody committed suicide that pulled the plug on that whole problem. So,
oh my God, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's scary.
Yeah.
Michael, tell us a little. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, we only have about 6 minutes left. So, Michael, can you tell us what your future projects are, what you're focusing on coming up next?
Well, right now, a few weeks ago, I was engaged for another case, litigation, a mining-related case involving uranium, and I'll be working real hard on that. We're still getting people calling in wanting to talk about the Alaska Seward Peninsula project. I would normally turn to my oldest son, and if we can get something rolling up there, to do some more drilling and sampling and really opening that basin to see if there is, because we have to drill it first before we can tell whether that basin actually contains uranium. And I think it's like a 75% of a chance it does, enough to spend a few $100,000 on it. But he's gotten himself busy with the UX group as a computer engineer now, and he's making a lot more money than I could pay him. So I'm sort of losing him. So that would be kind of hard. But I'm keeping busy and doing the I2M web portal, which is I review uranium related rare earth stuff and and either put it into the database. We have now almost 12,000 records. It's searchable, totally searchable. And I point people toward that. If you want to know, you just type in a question or a few keywords, and that'll bring up the most current information available about things. I didn't mention it before because it was self-serving, but the fact is, it is a good source of information about nuclear power and about uranium.
Mm-hmm. Now, actually, one thing our listeners probably like to hear in our last few minutes is the idea of how you actually mine uranium and what the ore actually is.
Well, uranium, briefly, uranium comes in two different types, actually. There's uranium deposits that occur in sedimentary rocks like sandstones. And then there's uranium that occurs in hard rocks, such as like granites and granodiorites and that sort of thing. On the former, we have learned we don't have to mine by open pit or underground even in the sedimentary related or in sandstone. We can do something called in situ mining, which you just drill holes and you include water and CO2 and circulate it through, put it into solution and bring it out and put it into a processing plant to make yellow cake, and off you go to the other enrichment circuits. But with igneous and metamorphic rocks, you have to do an open pit or underground. The mines in the Athabasca Basin in Canada are absolutely super world class. In fact, some of that, well, all that has to be underground or open pit because it's all igneous and metamorphic related mostly. But the ore grades, well, the ore grades of the sandstone is usually just less than 1%. But the ore grades of the Canadian deposits can run as much as 25% of total U3O8, which is the total in situ low, it may be high percentage, but doesn't mean it's terribly radioactive. Yes, it's higher radioactive, but it's still, not all that much. But in underground, they may have to go, it's so high in some of those mines, they may have to use remote mining because they wouldn't want to expose too many people with that high a grade. So we had never seen that grade in all my experience before until maybe 10 years ago, ever seeing that kind of grade. We were also used to the lower grade, but that's what produces the uranium for the 440 power plants or nuclear reactors there are in this world, and it's increasing quickly because China is putting one out a year in their own country, one a year. One a year once they get their supply chain going. And Russia was doing all right until now they've screwed themselves up, and I don't think they're going to be around doing nuclear power plants much anymore. So that's personal opinion. But so anyway, that's the answer to that. Yeah.
Well, that's great. It's really wonderful because so much negative news in the world today. I think it's depressing for people. So, I mean, this show has been a very positive overview and also a projection to the future, especially these small modular reactors. I mean, that sounds very, very exciting. I presume you could put them in the north then too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They go anywhere. And in fact, they are built as a small reactor that can move around with a truck or a train. And they are self-contained reactors. And all they have to do is they're put in a big hole and they build a little teeny plant on top of it. And that's why nobody could grab anything radioactive. And once every 7 or 8 years, a big old truck would come along, they pull that whole assembly out, put it on a truck, replace it with a new one.
Wow.
All it's doing is it's just creating heat. And the article that Tom and I wrote for American Out Loud that appeared today, which we took 100% from your writings, has an illustration of a modular reactor on a truck, holding it somewhere.
Yeah. Well, our guest today has been Houston-based geologist Michael D. Campbell. He's the senior principal and chief hydrogeologist of I2M Consulting, LLC. So it's been a great show. Thanks for having you on, Michael.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay.
Good to see you, Jay.
Thank you, Michael.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is Dr. Jay Lair and Tom Harris signing out from the other side of the story.